Welcome to Dreamscape Gaming, where we explore fascinating topics at the intersection of knowledge and entertainment. Today, we're delving into a subject that has captivated minds for millennia: the attributes of God. Whether you're a believer, an agnostic, or simply curious about theology, understanding these concepts can provide valuable insights into how different cultures and religions perceive the divine. Let's begin our journey by exploring what we mean when we talk about God's attributes. In essence, these are the characteristics or qualities that describe the nature and character of God. They're attempts by theologians and philosophers to articulate the ineffable, to put into words the qualities of a being that, by many definitions, transcends human understanding. We'll be breaking down these attributes into three main categories: entitative, moral, and relational. Each category offers a different perspective on the divine, and together, they form a comprehensive picture of how many religions conceptualize God. Let's start with the entitative attributes. These are the qualities that speak to God's very being, the core of what God is. The first of these is infinity. When we say God is infinite, we're suggesting that God is limitless in power, knowledge, and goodness. There are no boundaries or constraints on God's abilities or nature. This concept can be mind-bending to contemplate. As finite beings, we're used to everything having limits, but the attribute of infinity suggests a being beyond all limits, beyond all measure. Next, we have the attribute of simplicity. Now, this might seem counterintuitive at first. After all, isn't God supposed to be complex beyond our understanding? But in theological terms, simplicity doesn't mean easy to understand. Instead, it refers to the idea that God is indivisible and without parts. Unlike humans, who have bodies and minds, or even unlike the universe, which is made up of countless components, God is thought to be a unified whole, not composed of separate elements. The attribute of immutability follows. This suggests that God is unchanging in his essence and character. While the world around us is in constant flux, God remains steadfast and consistent. This attribute offers comfort to many believers, as it implies that God's nature, promises, and love are constant and reliable. Eternity is another entitative attribute of God. This doesn't just mean that God lives forever. It suggests that God exists outside of time itself. God has no beginning and no end, no past or future. All of time, from our perspective, is eternally present to God. This concept challenges our linear understanding of time and suggests a being for whom the constraints of past, present, and future don't apply. The final entitative attribute we'll discuss is spirituality. This attribute posits that God is not a physical being but pure spirit. Unlike humans or other creatures, God doesn't have a body or exist in a particular location. This ties into other attributes we'll discuss later, like omnipresence. Now, let's move on to the moral attributes of God. These characteristics describe God's moral nature and character. The first of these is holiness. When we say God is holy, we're suggesting that God is perfectly good and separate from all evil. Holiness implies a purity of character that sets God apart from all creation. Closely related to holiness is the attribute of goodness. This suggests that God is not just good, but is the very source of all that is good and right in the universe. It's an attribute that has profound implications for how we understand morality and ethics. Love is perhaps one of the most celebrated attributes of God in many religions. This isn't just any kind of love, but a love that is perfect, unconditional, and everlasting. It's a love that doesn't depend on the worthiness of its object, but flows freely from God's nature. Justice is another key moral attribute. This suggests that God is perfectly fair and upholds righteousness. It's an attribute that can sometimes seem in tension with others, like love or mercy, leading to rich theological discussions about how these attributes interact. The final moral attribute we'll discuss is faithfulness. This suggests that God is always true to his promises and character. It ties closely with the idea of immutability. God doesn't just make promises, but keeps them unfailingly. Now, let's turn our attention to the relational attributes of God. These describe how God interacts with creation. The first of these is sovereignty. This attribute suggests that God has supreme authority over all things. It's a concept that speaks to God's rulership and control over the universe. Next, we have the attribute of omnipotence. This is the idea that God is all-powerful and can do anything according to his will. It's an attribute that has sparked much philosophical debate. For instance, can an omnipotent being create a rock so heavy they can't lift it? These kinds of paradoxes have led to nuanced discussions about the nature of omnipotence. Omniscience is another key relational attribute. This suggests that God is all-knowing, having perfect knowledge of all things, past, present, and future. It's an attribute that raises interesting questions about free will and the nature of time. The final relational attribute we'll discuss is omnipresence. This is the idea that God is present everywhere simultaneously. It's not that God is spread out across the universe, but rather that God is fully present at every point in space. Now that we've covered the basic categories and attributes, let's dive deeper into what theologians often call the big three: omniscience, omnipotence, and omnipresence. These attributes are particularly fascinating because of their far-reaching implications and the philosophical questions they raise. Let's start with omniscience, the attribute of being all-knowing. When we say God is omniscient, we're suggesting that God has complete and perfect knowledge of everything. This isn't just knowledge of what has happened or what is happening, but also what will happen. God's knowledge, according to this attribute, extends to our thoughts, our actions, and even the choices we'll make in the future. This attribute has profound theological implications. One of the most significant is how it relates to the concept of free will. If God knows everything that will happen, including the choices we'll make, can we truly be said to have free will? Are our choices really our own if they're known in advance? This has been a subject of intense philosophical and theological debate for centuries. Some argue that God's foreknowledge doesn't negate free will, but simply means God knows what we will freely choose. Others suggest that true omniscience is incompatible with free will, leading to various theories about the nature of God's knowledge or the nature of human freedom. On the other hand, the concept of omniscience can be a source of comfort for believers. The idea that God has perfect knowledge and understanding can provide reassurance in times of confusion or uncertainty. It suggests a God who is never surprised, never caught off guard, and always able to provide perfect guidance. Omniscience also raises interesting questions about the nature of time. If God knows the future, does that mean the future is fixed? Or does God's knowledge somehow transcend our linear understanding of time? These questions intersect with complex philosophical discussions about the nature of time itself. Now, let's turn our attention to omnipotence, the attribute of being all-powerful. This attribute suggests that God has unlimited power and can do anything he wills. It's an attribute that speaks to God's supreme authority and control over all of creation. Like omniscience, omnipotence raises some intriguing philosophical questions. One of the most famous is the paradox of the stone. Can an omnipotent being create a stone so heavy that they cannot lift it? If yes, then there's something God can't do, lift the stone. If no, then there's something God can't do, create such a stone. This paradox has led to nuanced discussions about the nature of omnipotence. Many theologians argue that omnipotence doesn't mean the ability to do literally anything, but rather the ability to do anything that's logically possible and consistent with God's nature. So, for instance, God couldn't create a square circle not because of a lack of power, but because the concept itself is logically incoherent. One of the most significant theological implications of omnipotence is how it relates to the problem of evil. If God is all-powerful, why does evil exist? Why doesn't God simply eliminate all suffering and wrongdoing? This question has led to a whole branch of theology and philosophy known as theodicy, which attempts to reconcile the existence of an all-powerful, all-good God with the reality of evil and suffering in the world. Various responses have been proposed to this dilemma. Some argue that free will necessitates the possibility of evil. Others suggest that some evil is necessary for greater goods or for spiritual growth. Still others propose that our limited perspective prevents us from understanding God's reasons for allowing evil. Each of these responses has its own strengths and challenges, and the debate continues to this day. On a more positive note, the concept of omnipotence emphasizes God's ability to create, sustain, and intervene in the world. For many believers, it's a source of hope and comfort, suggesting that no problem is too big for God to handle, no situation too dire for God to resolve. The final member of the big three is omnipresence, the attribute of being present everywhere. This attribute suggests that God is not limited by space and is fully present at every point in the universe simultaneously. It's an attribute that challenges our spatial understanding of reality. Omnipresence doesn't mean that God is spread out across the universe like some kind of divine gas. Rather, the idea is that God is fully present everywhere. It's a concept that's difficult for us to grasp, as we're used to things, including ourselves, being localized in space. This attribute has several important theological implications. For many believers, it's a source of comfort and reassurance. The idea that God is always present, no matter where you are, can provide a sense of divine companionship and support. It suggests that you're never truly alone, that God is always with you, whether you're on top of a mountain or in the depths of the ocean. Omnipresence also raises interesting questions about the nature of God's interaction with the physical world. If God is everywhere, how does that relate to the idea of divine intervention? Does God's presence mean constant involvement in every aspect of reality, or is it more of a passive presence? Some theologians have used the concept of omnipresence to discuss ideas like panentheism, the belief that the universe exists within God, while God also transcends the universe. This is different from pantheism, which equates God with the universe. In panentheism, God is both immanent, present throughout the universe, and transcendent, beyond the universe. The attribute of omnipresence also intersects with scientific concepts in interesting ways. For instance, how does omnipresence relate to our understanding of space-time in modern physics? If space itself is a property of the universe, and God transcends the universe, what does that mean for God's presence? These are just some of the fascinating questions and implications that arise from considering the big three attributes of God. But it's important to remember that these are not the only attributes ascribed to God in various theological traditions. For instance, we have attributes like justice and mercy, which some see as being in tension with each other. How can God be perfectly just giving everyone exactly what they deserve, and also merciful, not giving people the punishment they deserve? Theologians have proposed various ways of reconciling these attributes, often suggesting that they find their perfect balance in God's nature. Then there's the attribute of love, which many religions place at the very center of God's nature. This isn't just any kind of love, but a perfect, unconditional, self-giving love. It's an attribute that has profound implications for how believers understand their relationship with God and with each other. The attribute of holiness is another important one in many traditions. This suggests that God is not just good, but perfectly good, set apart from all evil and impurity. It's an attribute that emphasizes the transcendence of God, the idea that God is fundamentally different from and superior to creation. We also have attributes like wisdom and truth. These suggest that God not only knows everything, omniscience, but understands the best course of action in any situation, wisdom, and is the source and standard of all truth. The attribute of freedom is interesting to consider. This suggests that God is not constrained by anything outside of his own nature. God doesn't act out of compulsion or necessity, but out of free choice. This attribute intersects in complex ways with others like omniscience and immutability. Another attribute worth mentioning is self-existence or aseity. This is the idea that God doesn't depend on anything else for his existence. Unlike created beings, who depend on external factors like food, air, etc., to survive, God is completely self-sufficient. This attribute emphasizes the fundamental difference between God and creation. It's important to note that while we've been discussing these attributes individually, many theologians emphasize that they shouldn't be understood as separate parts of God. Remember the attribute of divine simplicity we mentioned earlier? This suggests that God isn't composed of parts, but is a unified whole. So these attributes aren't like different aspects of God's personality, but different ways of describing the single, unified divine nature. This idea of divine simplicity has led to interesting theological discussions. For instance, some argue that God doesn't just have love as an attribute, but that God is love. The same goes for other attributes. A god isn't just wise, but is wisdom itself. This perspective sees the divine attributes not as properties God possesses, but as ways of describing what God is. It's also worth noting that different religious and philosophical traditions emphasize different attributes. For instance, in some strands of Christian thought, love is seen as the central attribute of God, from which all others flow. In Islamic theology, the oneness or unity of God, tawhid, is often emphasized. In some philosophical traditions, attributes like simplicity or aseity are given particular importance. The study of divine attributes also intersects with other areas of theology and philosophy in interesting ways. For instance, how do these attributes relate to the doctrine of the Trinity in Christian thought? How do they connect to ideas about the afterlife or the nature of salvation? How do they influence our understanding of ethics and morality? These attributes also have practical implications for religious life. The belief in an omniscient God might influence how a person prays or thinks about their actions. The concept of divine love might shape how a believer understands their relationship with God and with others. The idea of God's justice might inform views on morality and social issues. It's important to remember that these attributes, while attempting to describe the nature of God, are ultimately human concepts trying to grasp something that many religious traditions consider to be beyond full human comprehension. Many theologians would argue that while these attributes can give us true insights into God's nature, they are inevitably limited by human language and understanding. This recognition of the limits of human understanding when it comes to the divine is an important aspect of many theological traditions. It's often referred to as apophatic theology or the via negativa, the idea that we can sometimes better understand God by recognizing what God is not, rather than trying to positively define what God is. This approach acknowledges the mystery at the heart of the divine. It suggests that while attributes like omniscience or omnipotence can give us valuable insights into God's nature, they ultimately fall short of fully capturing the reality of God. It's an approach that combines intellectual inquiry with a sense of humility and awe in the face of the divine. At the same time, the study of divine attributes isn't just an abstract theological exercise. For many believers, reflecting on these attributes can deepen their faith and enrich their spiritual lives. Understanding God as omnipresent, for instance, might bring comfort in times of loneliness. Contemplating God's love might inspire greater compassion towards others. Reflecting on God's justice might motivate work for social change. Moreover, these concepts have had a profound influence on philosophy, literature, art, and culture more broadly. Ideas about the nature of God have shaped how societies think about morality, purpose, and the nature of reality itself. Even for those who don't believe in God, engaging with these concepts can provide valuable insights into human thought and culture. As we wrap up our exploration of the attributes of God, it's worth reflecting on the broader implications of these ideas. Whether or not one believes in God, these concepts raise profound questions about the nature of existence, consciousness, morality, and purpose. They challenge us to think beyond our everyday experience and consider the fundamental nature of reality. For instance, the concept of omniscience raises questions about the nature of knowledge and time. What does it mean to know everything? Is the future determined if it can be known in advance? These questions intersect with ongoing debates in philosophy and physics about the nature of time and causality. The attribute of omnipotence, meanwhile, touches on questions of possibility and necessity. What does it mean for something to be possible or impossible? Are there logical constraints on what can exist or occur? These questions relate to ongoing discussions in modal logic and metaphysics. Omnipresence challenges our spatial understanding of reality. It invites us to consider what it means for something to exist in space, and whether there could be modes of existence that transcend spatial limitations. This connects with discussions in physics about the nature of space and the possibility of extra dimensions. The moral attributes of God, like goodness and justice, relate to fundamental questions in ethics. Is there an objective standard of goodness? What does it mean for something to be just? These are questions that continue to be debated in moral philosophy. The attribute of love, particularly as understood in some religious traditions as unconditional and self-giving, challenges our understanding of relationships and value. It raises questions about the nature of love itself and the possibility of a love that transcends self-interest. Even the very idea of a being with these attributes pushes us to consider the limits of our understanding. It raises questions about the nature of concepts like infinity and perfection, and about the capabilities and limitations of human cognition. In this way, the study of divine attributes serves as a kind of ultimate thought experiment. It pushes our concepts to their limits, forcing us to grapple with ideas that stretch the boundaries of human understanding. Whether approached from a perspective of faith or purely as a philosophical exercise, engaging with these concepts can expand our intellectual horizons and deepen our appreciation for the complexity of existence. As we consider these attributes, it's also worth reflecting on how our understanding of them has evolved over time. The way we conceptualize ideas like omniscience or omnipotence today may be quite different from how they were understood in ancient times. Our expanding scientific knowledge and philosophical sophistication have led to more nuanced and complex interpretations of these attributes. For instance, advances in our understanding of quantum mechanics have led some thinkers to propose new ways of understanding divine omniscience that are compatible with quantum indeterminacy. Similarly, our growing awareness of the vastness and complexity of the universe has influenced how we think about divine omnipresence and omnipotence. These evolving interpretations highlight an important point. Our understanding of the divine, like all human knowledge, is not static. It grows and changes as our understanding of the world around us deepens. This doesn't necessarily mean that the divine itself changes, but rather that our ability to comprehend and articulate these concepts develops over time. It's also important to note that while we've primarily focused on monotheistic conceptions of God in this discussion, the idea of divine attributes is not limited to monotheistic religions. Polytheistic traditions often ascribe various attributes to different deities, and non-theistic spiritual traditions may speak of ultimate reality or the nature of existence in ways that parallel some of these divine attributes. For example, in some forms of Buddhism, the concept of sunyata or emptiness shares some similarities with the idea of divine simplicity. In Hinduism, the concept of Brahman as the ultimate reality is often described in terms that echo attributes like omnipresence and self-existence. This universality suggests that these attributes speak to fundamental human intuitions about the nature of ultimate reality. Whether conceived of as a personal God, an impersonal force, or simply the fundamental nature of existence, many traditions grapple with ideas of ultimacy, perfection, and transcendence that mirror these divine attributes in various ways. As we conclude our exploration of the attributes of God, it's worth reflecting on why these concepts continue to captivate human thought. Perhaps it's because they speak to our deepest questions about the nature of reality and our place in it. They challenge us to think beyond our immediate experience and consider the possibility of something greater than ourselves. For believers, contemplating these attributes can be a form of worship, a way of deepening their understanding and appreciation of the divine. For philosophers and theologians, they provide rich material for intellectual exploration, pushing the boundaries of human thought and language. For skeptics, engaging with these concepts can sharpen critical thinking skills and provide insights into the history of human thought. Regardless of one's personal beliefs, engaging with these ideas can be a profoundly enriching experience. They invite us to stretch our minds, to grapple with concepts at the very limits of human understanding. In doing so, they can expand our intellectual horizons and deepen our appreciation for the complexity and mystery of existence. As we've seen, the attributes of God are not just abstract theological concepts, but ideas that touch on fundamental questions about the nature of reality, consciousness, morality, and purpose. They challenge us to think deeply about what it means to exist, to know, to act, and to love. Whether approached from a perspective of faith, philosophical inquiry, or simply intellectual curiosity, these concepts offer a rich field for exploration and reflection. They remind us of the profound mysteries that lie at the heart of existence and invite us to continually deepen our understanding of ourselves and the world around us. In the end, perhaps the most important thing about these attributes is not whether we can fully comprehend them, but how engaging with them can broaden our perspective and deepen our appreciation for the profound mystery of existence. They remind us that there is always more to learn, more to explore, more to contemplate. As we conclude this exploration, I encourage you to continue pondering these ideas. How do they relate to your own understanding of reality? How might they influence your perspective on life, purpose, and meaning? Remember, the goal isn't necessarily to arrive at definitive answers, but to engage in the process of questioning and reflection. Thank you for joining me on this intellectual journey through the attributes of God. As always, I encourage you to continue learning, to keep questioning, and to never stop exploring the profound mysteries of existence. Until next time, this is Dreamscape Gaming signing off.